Hello, everyone. This is Travis Henderson. I appreciate everyone for tuning into Module 6 presentation. I'll be your speaker. Definitely a lot of information to go over this week. Without further ado, I'll get right into it. This week's content focused on fairness, relationships, and the forces that determine whether a person seeks help or offers help to others. More specifically, this content for this week focuses on factors related to social exchange, attraction, and relationships, as well as altruism and helping behaviors. We'll talk about each one of these topics individually. They're all fairly close to being interrelated. Um, First, we'll kind of dive into exchange theory, followed by attraction, and then we'll wrap up with altruism and helping behaviors. So social exchange and equity go hand in hand with regard to relationships. Social exchange, though it's an economic model, points out that relationships which maximize rewards and minimize costs will endure over those that don't. That being said, equity is a profound topic, especially with relationships. Chady points out that fairness or distributive justice is at the core of equity theory. So people want to be treated fairly. They want their outcomes to be fair. They want to equal what their partners' outcomes are. So it's centered around inputs, outcomes, rewards, and costs. Given this, equity theory is when both parties feel that their inputs are about equal to their outcomes. One, when considering the individual, people are driven to maximize their outcomes to the extent that outcomes equal rewards minus costs. Two, collective rewards and costs must be considered, and groups try to induce equity by rewarding members who treat one another equitably by punishing members who treat others inequitably. Three, people become distressed when they perceive inequity in their relationships. And then lastly, people will attempt to eliminate the distress by restoring equity. So restoration of equity can be characterized by a number of techniques. One could decrease one's inputs. So say for instance someone feels that they're putting more into a relationship than they're receiving out of it. One could decrease their inputs so their inputs equal their outcomes. Obviously, the latter would be increasing one's outcomes, which means that their inputs would be consistent, but their outcomes would be increased in order to match what they're inputting. And then the latter, you could raise your partner's outcomes or reduce the outcomes for your partner, such as punishment. All of these things are either conscious or unconscious methods of restoring equity in a relationship. Another point that I want to bring up is, equity in society seems to be a social norm. In a really interesting study by Leary et al., researchers look to examine why strong emotional responses can be incited from minor events. The researchers basically collected results from a sample of 179 college students consisting of graduate and undergraduate. In this case, they were instructed to recall a time an individual made them feel negatively. This was followed by a survey regarding the relationship thereafter. These results basically indicate that emotional responses are at least fueled in part by perceptions that the offending party has violated social norms. So people want to feel like they're being treated fairly, and this is definitely ingrained into society. It can definitely be something that we all live by. So as we move along, the last section that we'll talk about in this presentation is attraction and close relationships. As one can probably expect, social relations heavily impacts the initial attraction of individuals and the formation and maintenance of relationships. Building on the fact that people are social creatures, there's a fundamental human motive to belong. As mentioned in Casson et al., people experience a thrill of affiliation and agony in relation to loneliness. Typically, relationships are formed through initial attraction. In the text, it points out that a few factors play into initial attraction, such as the proximity effect or the likelihood of forming a relationship has much to do with the physical proximity of two people. The book talks about how people lived in the same neighborhood or lived in the same city were very much more likely to initiate a relationship. The mere exposure effect, which is a phenomenon which people rate a stimulus more positively the more exposed they are to it. And then obviously, physical attractiveness. Physical attractiveness seems to be an innate bias within humans. One study even found that babies will focus on more attractive faces longer than reportedly less attractive faces. And this bias extends into most areas of our life, such as likability, career, and perception of one's character. There's even a term called the "what is beautiful is good" stereotype. In this case, people are inclined to believe that someone who is perceivably attractive typically has positive character and good personality attributes. Obviously, this isn't always the case, but due to this bias that we all experience, it's definitely something that plays into initial attraction, at least. Before I move too far along here, attraction can also be initiated by those who are similar to us and by the idea of reciprocity or liking those who like us. The text points out that consistent throughout cultures, men valued looks and quote no previous experience in sexual intercourse. Most in mate selection, whereas women rated good financial prospect and ambitious and industrious as valued attributes. So men also typically seek out a younger partner, and women usually look for a man that's on average of 3.4 years older. This can be related to an evolutionary perspective that regardless of one's conscious behavior, humans have an innate sense of mate selection. Other behaviors in relation to evolutionary perspective include conspicuous consumption, which could be related to a man's willingness to buy flashy clothes or to have a flashy car. There's even been studies where women preferred a man who had a flashy car over one who drove a modest vehicle. And women wearing the color red. There's a number of examples from an evolutionary perspective as to why people do this. And studies have basically shown that women are much more inclined to wear the color red when they anticipate meeting or communicating with an attractive male. So, to some, close relationships are seen as the most important aspect of one's life. Intimate relationships or a close relationship between two adults involving emotional attachment, fulfillment of psychological needs, or interdependence are very much related to social exchange theory. Relationship type and relationship length can obviously predict the amount of equity experienced. In the same token, Chadee explains that the relation to someone who has been divorced, or at least in the case where someone has been divorced, women report a greater importance of equity in their second marriage than in their first. Basic equity basically posits that one's benefits in relation to one's contributions are equal to one's partner's benefits in relation to one's partner's contribution. This being said, even though that's the case, equity theory is defined as the theory that people are most satisfied with a relationship when the ratio between benefits and contributions are similar for both. Though this is the case, if one believes equity exists, like stated earlier, then if both parties believe equity exists, then equity is present. So the central focus of the content for this week is basically fairness of exchanges with partners. As stated earlier with equity theory, partners tend to weigh costs and rewards as well as inputs and outcomes when assessing equity. Many times, if inequity arises in a relationship, partner may practice relational maintenance, in which one behaves in a way to preserve the desired relationship, or at least the relationship state. Inequity may also cause one to demand equity, expend less effort to restore equity, and it could obviously affect sexual behaviors. Building on that, if inequity is present for too long, a partner may practice disengagement strategies in order to initiate a breakup. Equity plays such a major role in relationships that it can even predict if two people remain friends following a breakup. Chady points out when undergraduate students were asked to reflect on past breakups, as much as 12% attributed inequity for the reason of the split. So the last section that we'll talk about is in relation to helping or pro-social behaviors. There's obviously some debate on what drives helping behaviors. In this section, we'll kind of discuss how some people are more inclined to help others or they're more inclined to help certain people over others. Casson basically begs the question of whether people perform social behaviors out of true altruism or to help themselves. Or when they're helping themselves, it's typically emotionally, or if someone performs helping behaviors out of empathy for another person. When attempting to answer the question of why people help others, you could take the bystander effect into account. In this case, people are willing to not act when faced with an individual in need, with the predisposition to assume that someone else will be the person who takes action. There's a couple different examples of this. Kessin et al. Basically mentions, a 2-year-old girl in China being run over multiple times by different cars, despite being in very close proximity to so many different people. The child was left there for several minutes and later died in the hospital a week later. There's another example of the Kitty Genovese situation where I believe it was over 30 people witnessed a woman being beaten, and they chose to do nothing about it, with the assumption that somebody else would act. So pro-social behaviors are actions that benefit others, can be evolutionary or learned. In the case for the bystander effect, some people may not want to be involved. Conflicts with helping behaviors can occur due to pluralistic influence, diffusing responsibility, and audience inhibition. Each of these definitely play an impact on it. Pluralistic influence is defined by the text as a state in which people in a group mistakenly think that their own individual thoughts, feelings, or behaviors are somehow different from those of the others in the group. Diffusion of responsibility is basically the belief that others will or should take responsibility for providing assistance to a person in need. And audience inhibition is a reluctance to help for fear of making a bad impression of observers. This really hits home with the fact that humans are social creatures, and our perceptions of the world around us definitely affect how we behave, at least to a point. So obviously, there's a number of roles that play into helping behaviors. Gender roles is amongst them. Researchers in a really interesting study examined gender roles in the context of altruism. Basically, the paper found that women were more likely to have innate altruism over men, and women were basically punished more severely or harshly than men for failing to be altruistic or display pro-social behaviors. this goes back to the idea that altruism and these social relations are normative in society and our immediate groups. In this case, women are perceived to, or I guess expected to exhibit altruism more frequently than men. There's also, as pointed out in the text, that uh, as far considering gender roles, women who tend to display more masculine attributes. Um, there's a correlation between how much or how masculine a female is and how much altruism she displays. So this kind of goes back to gender roles and how it all plays into everything. So there's a lot of other things that impact altruism. Personal and interpersonal influences may also play an impact in altruism. Personality influences are innate personal characteristics which influence how likely someone is to display altruistic behavior, such as the actions of Mother Teresa. And conversely, who we help is somewhat different. The book points out that even though certain people may be more inclined to help, people may be more likely to help certain people over others, such as those who are similar or part of similar groups. This could be caused in part by identity fusion, or one's a strong sense of oneness and shared identity with a group and its individual members. Other factors playing into helping behaviors include role model influence, time pressure, mood, culture, and obviously going back to it, attractiveness. So this week we covered a lot of information with regard to equity theory and relationships. So the first question for this week would: how do you think equity theory plays into exchange relationships in the workplace? We talked about close relationships. I think that the relationships in the workplace are something that we're all going to have to face. So, and then the second question, Psalm 112 verses 5 through 9 states, "It is well with the man who is gracious and lends; he will maintain his cause in judgment." Um, Thinking in terms of this, what factors do you feel drive Christians to perform charitable acts? And what forces may cause a Christian to refrain from pro-social behaviors? Definitely an interesting way of looking at it. Definitely interested on your responses. I do want to thank everybody who took the time to review this presentation. I know that it drug out a lot. We had a lot of information to cover. I look forward to your responses in the discussion. Have a great night. Thanks for listening.